Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack. Welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about application development, deployment, and management at scale. CloudBees Jenkins X has a new UI made for the demands of continuous development. Learn more about CloudBees, Jenkins X, and the CloudBees leadership in CI/CD at cloudbees.com. Here we are at KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon San Diego 2019. Here for our first recording, our first interview of the day. I am here with Moritz Plassnig. How are you, Moritz?
Good, how are you?
And Peter Muir. And you're both with CloudBees. Hi, Peter.
Hi.
So, Moritz, you're Vice President of Cloud at CloudBees, and Peter, you're a lead architect at CloudBees. And one of the things I want to talk about, how continuous delivery is one of the most talked about subjects, I think much more pronounced now more than ever. And CloudBees, became a company that really became recognized for Jenkins, and now Jenkins X is emerging as your continuous delivery platform, and you are one of the co-founders of the Continuous Delivery Foundation. My question is, now you're looking at the user interface, right? Mm-hmm. And how it's changing. What is the reflection of this new user interface that you're developing in context with the evolution of continuous development as you've seen it over the past few years?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Jenkins X, we open sourced it a year and a half ago, and for the last 18 months there was no graphical user interface, which I think is good because we focused on a CLI first approach, and it worked very, very well for developers, and we did a lot of work around that and fine-tuned that. But then I think over time, and as you said, I think CD becomes very mainstream now. I think we all have been talking about it for I don't know how many years, and it always felt like it's the way to go, and that is how software should be developed. But I think in 2019, it really feels like it's like we're finally there. And so when we looked at Jenkins X, it became very clear that there are many other people at the end of the day interacting with the product and the open source project that are not developers. So some people just want a button that they can press, right? Versus running a CLI command. And I think that reflects, going back to your question a little bit, that more and more stakeholders in especially large companies are involved when it comes to CD. It's not just the developers, right? Getting a large company to move from like a monthly release cycle to deploying like multiple times per day involves many more people than just developers.
So Peter, what are you hearing from developers? What are they saying, and how are you reflecting that in the overall architecture, and then as a result the UI really?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things we always hear from developers is as there's been this whole sort of focus on bringing ops and developers closer together, which I think is a really good thing, because I think it actually makes, as a developer, I come from a development background, right? So as a developer, it makes you think about what you're building. How is it going to perform? How is it going to scale? How are we going to secure this? But for a lot of developers, that's not something they've really ever had to think about, right? They've always just written their code and given it to someone, and they make it work for them. And I think that's one of the big attractions of Jenkins X, is being able to use Kubernetes as a system for running your software, and really trying to make that a bit easier for developers to consume, using some of those great things that Kubernetes has brought in terms of how you can scale, how you can manage your deployments, how you can implement your security really well, but just trying to make that something that's a bit more accessible for developers. So as we look at things like the UI, I think for me, a lot of it is about how do we show developers some of those artifacts, what's running in the system, and trying to make it a bit easier for them to understand what they're actually building and how that's actually going to run. And I think we all know that can be easier to do in a GUI with graphs and pictures and diagrams than through a load of text that gets printed out on your screen.
Yeah. And then in that context, then, what are you doing to the UI? I think of how you're building a pipeline, and there's this almost this blending of Jenkins and Jenkins X. How are you trying to bring that blending into the UI itself, and what is, and then I guess a follow-up question would be, is this whole idea of that developer experience and how are you making them happy in that process?
Yeah, I think with Jenkins X, we really focus on developers that work with Kubernetes, right? Jenkins, and we celebrated 15 years of Jenkins at DevOps World this year. As you know, Jenkins can do everything, right? It's one of the huge advantages of Jenkins. It's extremely flexible, powerful. There's a plugin for everything. With Jenkins, you can do everything. With Jenkins X, we took a different approach. We are really focusing in on, if you're using Kubernetes, how should your CI/CD pipeline and your tooling look like? And so when we think of Jenkins X, there is a way to run Jenkins on top of Jenkins X, but right now we're really, really focused on making Jenkins X with Tekton work. Tekton is another open source project that's part of the Continuous Delivery Foundation, and it's a building block for building CI/CD tools. So when we worked on Jenkins X, we took a look at what are the tools that are available to us now, right? If we would build Jenkins in 2018, in 2019, how would Jenkins look like? And then we made the decision that we should leverage Tekton, because why reinvent the wheel all the time?
Why leverage Tekton?
Because it allows us, right? Tekton is a building block if you are using Kubernetes and want to build CI/CD tooling on top of it. If you don't use Tekton, right? My background is I did Coachy before, right? A CI/CD as a service product and company. We had to build all of that ourselves. We spent an awful lot of time writing code that does nothing else than taking a pipeline, figuring out how to run it on scale, how to run certain commands on, we didn't use in Kubernetes back then, in certain containers, how to orchestrate all of that. We spent a lot of time on that, but now looking back, I think we had to do it, but it didn't really create all that much value to the end user.
It's like saying, you have that? I mean, I don't have to build it myself? Yeah. I guess my follow-up question to that for you, Peter, is we did a one-question survey, and very scientific. And we asked people what the top issues were, and they said the number one was the administrative experience and the developer experience. So if Kubernetes experience is so rough for the developer, then what do you have to do to make up for that for people who are already using Kubernetes in that continuous delivery environment?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think to your first point about administration, that's not something we're necessarily addressing ourselves, but we partner with people like Google or Amazon or whoever, and work with them with their cloud platforms to enable you to run Kubernetes. And that's the way we do it ourselves, and it's a good experience, I would say. On the developer side, so I've been involved with Kubernetes for a long time. I'm a big fan of Kubernetes. I think it is as a developer, you need some abstraction that defines the things that you want to run. How are your services going to talk to one another? How are they going to do role-based access control? How are they going to scale horizontally? These things matter as a developer. Kubernetes provides, I think, the right building blocks for all of these things. So, and I'm also not a fan of hiding things, right, and building more abstractions on top. I think that just complicates things. So for me, a lot of it is about how do you use the principles of Kubernetes and make them more accessible. So this could be through better tooling, right? Better visualization. It could also be through better tooling in terms of rather than making people perhaps work directly with some of those underlying artifacts, maybe giving them some commands and things like that they can run to get things up and running quickly. It can also be just through automating things, right? So as a really good example, one of the things that we're a big proponent of is GitOps, which is using Git to store your configuration of everything. Now, Kubernetes doesn't provide any support for that out of the box. You'd have to go and build all of that. With Jenkins X, we give you all of the tools that you need to do that, which for me makes configuring Kubernetes and using Kubernetes much easier, because rather than having to go and figure out where all of my descriptors are and all my files are, I look in Git, they're all there laid out in front of me. So I think maybe for me the principle there is bringing some more opinion into the mix, bringing a stronger opinion about how you do things. That always makes it easier to get going if you've got a single opinionated way of doing things rather than having a big broad choice out there.
And adding to that, I think the pattern we have seen when we look at companies using Jenkins X and Kubernetes is that there are usually two groups in their development teams, right? There are a few Kubernetes experts, and they could do everything directly with Kubernetes themselves. For them, nothing would be a problem. But then we know from all our CloudBees customers, right? We have many very large companies as customers. It's very hard for them to hire Kubernetes talent. It's very expensive. And the majority of their developers are not Kubernetes experts. And so I think where Jenkins X is really powerful is it enables the first group, those Kubernetes experts, to give the by far larger group, all the other developers, the abstraction and the tooling and the development experience so that they can leverage Kubernetes, but in a fairly opinionated and, we believe, simplified way.
But they know Git, right? They understand Git.
Yeah.
And so is that then the source of truth then?
Yep. And we use that to control a lot of the workflows. So, as a developer, you're very used to creating a pull request, for example, right? So you create your pull request. We use that to automatically trigger all of our pipelines and even push your application all the way through to create a preview environment. So we create preview environments for every pull request so that, if you're working with your designer on a web UI, the designer can go in and check and see what changes you've made to the HTML and the CSS and kind of sign off on it, or your product manager can go and have a look at the feature. And we can use that, and we can use Git to drive that all the way through, even into your production environment, so that your entire pipeline is running around that. Not only is the developer familiar with Git, it also provides a really nice log, so that when something goes wrong, you can quickly go and say, not that I want to blame Mo, but just, if something goes wrong, I can at least say, Mo, can you please wake up and come and help us? You did this code change. Can you explain what your intent was, why you did it like this? Can we change it like that and not break something else you were trying to do? So for me, that kind of auditability of doing everything through Git, having that single source of truth is really useful.
And that becomes important as an organization begins to use Kubernetes more through their development tool chain, through their and how they think about their overall software supply chain. And I've heard in particular an issue with companies who are trying to build microservices on top of monoliths and the troubles that they run into when they do that. And if they have a configuration drift issue, for example, it can basically crash it. And you've got to start from the beginning. So I guess my question around that is, how do you avoid those problems? How do you help them through those issues? How does the continuous delivery environment that you're providing help them so they can, they don't have to learn the hard way, right?
Yeah, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, there's a number of things, and I'm trying to think about where to start. But I think maybe it's also, partly it's about not trying to force things too much. So if you've got a working system for your monolith and it's working for you, maybe I wouldn't be trying to say move to continuous delivery there. It's often, if you're getting started on the journey, I would definitely start with your microservices, and the things are going to be easier. I think the big thing for me around continuous delivery has always been about testing. So you've got to make sure you've got really robust testing in place, because otherwise you can't continuously deliver if you haven't really got good testing in place. So for me, I think I would be starting with looking at those microservices, looking at how I can improve the testing on them and push up the test coverage, and then looking where they're interacting with the monolith, looking at what we need to mock out, what we need to shim out in that, so that we can actually kind of actively test against something that looks vaguely like the monolith but probably isn't, because there's probably only one of those, right? There's no nice sort of replicas and all that going on. So those would be some of the things that I would do. I guess for me, the big challenge has always been about data, right? So you can mock out all these services and build out all these services, but at the end of the day, you're probably testing against mock data, and that, when you move to real data, that can be really, really tricky. And if you've got a monolith over there that's not being able to integrate into your test environment really well, that's a problem, I think. So
right.
that's hard.
Yeah, so I guess, in thinking about this event here and, and what you're discussing at this event, what are some of the things that are on your mind right now coming into KubeCon?
Yeah, I think the CDF is probably the first one because there's a side event today, and we see you have been there. I haven't had a chance to step by, but what we're seeing is that the CDF becomes more and more popular, which I think is great because at the end of the day, I think continuous delivery can't be defined by one vendor.
Yeah, and right. CDF, for those who don't know, is the Continuous Delivery Foundation, right?
Exactly, and there are 4 projects in it. Jenkins X is one of them, Tekton, and then also Jenkins and Spinnaker. And I think the more collaboration that happens around those projects, so looking at how could Jenkins and Spinnaker work together, I think they solve 2 different problems. How can also Jenkins X and Spinnaker work together? How does Jenkins X leverage Tekton? I think talking through where those projects overlap, don't overlap, and how we can collaborate and help the end users with best practices and help them figure out how to do continuous delivery in a better and faster way, I think is really important, and we as CloudBees couldn't do that alone. And no other vendor can do it alone. So I think the CDF is probably what comes to mind first.
What are the priorities that you're hearing from the community?
Many things.
Many things, yeah. So,
and it's not hierarchical in any manner, but I mean, what are some of the themes that you're?
Yeah, I will try first. And so Jenkins X, right, is an open source project. What CloudBees is doing now is there's a CloudBees Jenkins X distribution, which is a stable release that gets released monthly and is beta tested and basically certified by CloudBees, so that our large customers know what they get is working, and it only covers a subset of the Jenkins X functionality. And what we did there is we, in the beginning, and still are very focused on GKE. What we are hearing a lot from the community is we need battle-tested, production-grade EKS support, which is not surprising, right? I think I always describe GKE as the purest Kubernetes implementation, but then we know that Amazon is the market leader, right? And I think, you probably know the market data far better than I do. Most Kubernetes workloads are probably running on top of Amazon. So that's one heavily requested.
I think for me, one of the things that's quite interesting is we have this left-right spectrum, right, of everything shifting left, and then you've kind of got right more into deployments. For me, one of the things that's quite interesting is Jenkins X has been about bridging developers and deployment. Mm-hmm. And traditionally, we've lent quite heavily towards the left-hand side of that spectrum, right? So how do we make it easier for developers by moving everything onto the pull request so that the developer's working in their natural home? But one of the things that I'm quite excited about over the next few months is looking more at, how do we do more in the deployment area, right? So how do we, make some of these techniques like canary deployments easier to do from Jenkins X. You can do them today, but they're not an area. We talked about opinion earlier, right? So these are things you can do today, but they're not things we have a strong opinion and strong tooling around how you should do them. And that, for me, I think is something I'm really interested in. What are the right, and picking some of that out from the conference as well, what are some of the right patterns that people have found work well for them that we could build some tooling around to help make their lives easier in the future?
Yeah, and I think there are companies that are already pushing ahead, right, customers and end users, because I think continuous delivery is becoming mainstream now, and there are still many companies out there that aren't doing it, and aren't doing it for the majority of the applications. But then there are companies that are doing continuous delivery for many, many years, right? And I think when you look and talk with them, you can see all the things that we could still do and make fairly easy for all the Jenkins X users to adopt. One example would be not just gradually rolling out and having different deployment scenarios, but then how do you actually validate automatically that a deployment is really working, right? That whole notion of testing in production, I think, will become more and more important, because we all know it's great if you thoroughly test your code and every code change, right? But you never really know that it's working until you have deployed it and verified. And right now this is very hard, and most companies I talk to that are doing that, they have all built their own custom tooling for it. And I think, or we think, it should at the end of the day all be in Jenkins X, right? And you should be able to do that out of the box within a few minutes and don't have to build your own custom tooling.
So how are you thinking of that in terms of the UI?
Well, the UI is really a very important piece here. So I think I was going to just add on to what Mo was saying, and it really goes into what you're saying as well, which is it's one thing to roll the deployment back. It's another thing to, if you think of a developer's practice, like, so let's take Scrum. They've got this idea of a definition of done, right, which is when your code is done. What we're trying to do here is shift the definition of done more to the right, so that the developer's job is not done until the code is in production and being in production for a few days and not caused any problems. So how do you bring that back into the developer's daily workflow?
So how do you change then what is done?
Right, exactly, yeah, and that's where I think the UI can come in, right? So the UI can help you visualize that, but I think we've also got to think about how does that come back to things like pull requests, right? For me as a developer, my life tends to be pretty centered around pull requests. It's pretty much where I interact with people. And, is there a way to almost make it so that change that I've inserted, I don't know the answer to this, but that workflow of it's not done until it's actually been running in production for a few days, how does that actually come back into the developer's workflow? The UI is really important because it gives you a way to visualize it. But for me as a developer, quite honestly, I don't sit in my CI/CD UI. I sit on my pull request. And then when something goes wrong or when I need more information, that's when I dive into the CI/CD UI to understand what's going on.
And so then how do you think about teams and their workflows and in consideration of that?
You want me to tell me?
You can go for it.
So with Jenkins X, we try to be, that's an area where I think for us, we actually don't have an opinion around teams. Like, I think for us, we wouldn't want to sit there and say we have an opinion about how you should structure your teams. But
the technology has to fit within the team.
Exactly, it does, yeah. So we try to be reasonably flexible about that. So our kind of basic level is we say, for your project that you're working on, the thing that you're working on right now, we'll give you an isolated environment in which you can run. And we'll give you the ability to manage your permissions inside that and so on. You're responsible for bringing some of those outside pieces. We have another product that we're working on at CloudBees called Software Delivery Management. And that's starting to get a bit more into that whole sort of sphere of how does your team work? How do you make your team more productive? Value streams and that kind of more, I don't know, kind of social construct around programming. Jenkins X is probably more focused on the technical side, technical best practices.
This is when Git is still very much then the consideration there, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, and also how you achieve that desired state.
Yes.
Right, and so that teams and their workflows then have to think about rollback and Git as ways they can achieve that desired state. For that UI and its development, if we're hearing more about, AWS, how does that change your viewpoint? How does that affect your UI and its development?
Yeah, I think the big change will be once we get to the point where customers have clusters running on all cloud providers. Right now we are very focused on you are using GKE. You have a couple of teams using Jenkins X, and that's great. But the more adoption we are seeing, the more likely will be the scenario where a company uses all three, or even they run their own Kubernetes as a service product internally. I think then it will become very interesting how we structure Jenkins X around that and how that all shows up in the UI. Again, I think for the developer, we try to simplify. So we hope there will be a way where for the developer, the experience doesn't change and the developer could switch to a different team that uses a completely different cloud provider at the end of the day.
So there's a lot of work you need to do.
Oh, yes.
Like, what are some of the considerations that you need to think about?
I think, so the GitOps thing is very useful here because we're not using features inside the cloud platform in order to control the configuration of the system and how it's running. We're using Git. And so, if you wanted to have your development going on in GCP, but your production running in Amazon, for example, because your common point is your Git server, that's where your configuration is stored. We can push, when we push from development to, or promote from development to production, we can push to a Git repo and have the changes picked up. Another thing I would say here is, for me, always a lot of this comes back to essentially identity management. A lot of this is about permissions and a lot of it is about who can do what. We use Kubernetes native permission structures for a lot of this. And so in many ways, I was just thinking about what Mo was saying in terms of what we show to developers and so on. A lot of that is driven from what people have the ability to see and do within the system, and making sure that we gracefully degrade the UI so that if you have write access to development but read-only access to staging and no access to prod or limited access to prod, we're showing you the right information and gracefully degrading the UI, not just failing the UI because you didn't have the right access in the right place. But for me, having that kind of native use of the Kubernetes permission system is really key, because it means we're not having to, again, it's another thing we're not having to build. To go back to what you were saying about CodeShip, well, I'm sure when you built CodeShip, you had to do a lot of work on role-based access control, permissions. Building on top of that means we've got that framework there. We're not having to reinvent that wheel.
So when you're thinking about these issues and considerations, what is it that's on your mind, as we move into KubeCon and really following KubeCon? A lot of it I'm curious about your processes and your workflows internally and how you think about how you keep moving on to thinking about where what the developer is looking for, what they're needing. What is it in Jenkins X, in that UI and and other considerations that you're thinking about as we move forward into the rest of the year and beyond?
Yeah, I think KubeCon is the best way to interact with all our end users, right? So many are here. We usually don't meet them in person. We do many calls. We are on Slack. We are interacting on Twitter or whatever other channel. I think KubeCon is probably the one event besides our own events where we can talk to many end users, and also people who maybe took a look, right? They tried maybe Jenkins X 3 months ago, but it wasn't quite ready for them yet. Certain capabilities were missing, maybe certain integrations were missing, maybe they used very specific plugins with Jenkins and then they looked at Jenkins X, but the add-ons weren't there yet. So I think learning from the end users is the one really important
So give me some examples of how that has played out up until now, where developers are saying, I haven't tried Jenkins X, it's missing these X capabilities, and what has CloudBees done to actually fill the gaps?
Yeah, we listen to them, right? And then we prioritize. And then
what have been some of the priorities then? We probably discussed a few of them.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the big decision we made again is I think we decided that we double down on GKE, and within GKE, right? If you're using GKE, then Jenkins X should be great, right? So we decided, for example, we do the UI first before we add EKS, AKS, VKS, etc. support. Because we believe that before we go broad, the experience for the people that are on Google should be really good.
Which is a smart practice anyway, right? Though if you think about the UI from the more, you're not thinking from the absolute beginning because it was a command line interface, but
yeah,
yep,
you're pretty close.
I think it's smart, but it's also really hard, right? Because you have users every day telling you, look, we need this, and we're telling them, look, we are working on something else that you don't need because we believe it's more important. I think it's very hard to push back, but then we have to be opinionated, and I think we see some of that in Jenkins X, right? We talked about that we take a certain stance, and that's good, and if you like Jenkins X, that's great. If you don't, that's okay for now, right? We better make it great for the people who like it.
Yeah. Anything to add to that?
I'd say the other one we've talked about a lot is the UI, right? So, we made a decision early on that we were going to focus on the command line interface because, I think, particularly because we're comfortable with command line interfaces, you know, but we heard over and over again, I'm finding this hard to get started with. I kind of like the way I'm thinking about it is not, I find it hard to discover what's going on with the CLI. I want to just be able to see some stuff. So building and releasing the UI, I think, is a really good example of another thing where we've listened. I was going to say another thing that we do is we have a weekly office hours where we all get together on a Google Hangout, and that's a great opportunity for the community to bring really specific feedback, like this bug is really killing me, or that bug is really killing me. I really need this feature to be worked on, and that's one of the primary ways outside of events like this we really manage to get to interact with our users and get really high quality feedback from them.
I guess my last question is about Anthos. I know that you are integrating with Anthos, correct?
Yeah, we as CloudBees do a lot of work with Google around Anthos. With Jenkins X specifically, we haven't done that much yet, but we likely will. It really depends on how Anthos gets adopted, and then we will see.
Great. Well, I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you both for joining us. I think it all comes back to that UI, doesn't it? And it's when you think about companies that have really focused on that hard aspect of developing UI, you see the results in their software. And so best of luck with that. I think that's a consideration when you're thinking about not just GKE, but AWS and other platforms that you may, but be a part of in the future. The Git story is always interesting. The GitOps story is very interesting. I didn't ask where you get your inspiration from, but maybe you can just add that just before we go. But then in conclusion, I'm curious on how, with such a deep emphasis on the user experience, how that's going to play into the pipeline, for instance, in terms of like canary testing and such like that. So look forward to keeping in touch. But maybe in my last question, who has been your inspiration for GitOps?
Well, let me take a slightly broader one on that. So I would say the inspiration for a lot of Jenkins X is the Accelerate book. And that, the term GitOps, I think, originated about a year ago. But if you look back through
the approach.
But if you look back, it's been around for years, right? And I think that, for me, the Accelerate book, the State of DevOps reports, they really emphasize storing your configuration in Git. And when Jenkins X started, so mostly we started Jenkins X, 18 months ago? There wasn't GitOps. And about 3 or 4 months in, the team decided, we want to go all in on GitOps. And I think that was one of the best decisions we've made.
It's a good label.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both again for taking the time to talk, and we look forward to being in touch soon. I've been joined today by Moritz Plassnig, Vice President of Cloud at CloudBees, and Peter Muir, Lead Architect at CloudBees. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
CloudBees Jenkins X has a new UI made for the demands of continuous development. Learn more about CloudBees, Jenkins X, and the CloudBees leadership in CI/CD at cloudbees.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.